The heavy oak doors of St. Jude's of the Valley didn't lock with a click. They sealed with a pressurized thud, as if the air inside was a living thing trying to keep the rest of the world out. Julian stood in the nave, the scent of centuries-old incense, cold stone, and floor wax thick enough to coat the back of his throat. He was 24, and the night maintenance position had been a godsend. $1,200 a shift, paid in crisp, untraceable cash every morning at 6 a.m. The priest, a man named Father Miller, whose eyes seemed to be perpetually out of focus, as if he were looking at someone standing 2 feet behind Julian's shoulder, had handed him a mop, a bucket of grayish water that never seemed to get sudsy, and a laminated card. "The order doesn't matter," the priest had whispered, his voice like dry husks rubbing together. "But the obedience does. If you hear the bells, don't look at the clock. The clock is a liar, Julian. It counts moments that haven't happened yet." Julian looked down at the card. The text wasn't printed. It was embossed in a deep velvet red that looked uncomfortably like dried blood under the flickering halogen lights of the vestibule. St. Jude's after-hours maintenance protocols. The pews must be wiped from back to front. If you find a damp spot that smells like seawater, do not clean it. Cover it with a prayer cloth and leave the building for 10 minutes. The drowned parishioner is simply catching his breath. He is shy about his lungs. The confessionals are to remain empty. If you hear whispering from behind the curtain, do not offer absolution. Say, "The Father is sleeping," and tap the wood 3 times. If the whispering turns to screaming, start the vacuum. It hates the sound of motors, as they remind it of the future. At some point, the candles will light themselves for the midnight mass. We do not hold a midnight mass. Do not enter the sanctuary while the candles are burning. If you see shadows kneeling in the pews, keep your eyes on the floor and finish the vestibule. Do not join the chorus. Their key is not for human throats. The statues of the saints must always face the altar. If you find St. Peter looking at the door, he's trying to warn you of a guest. Lock the inner sanctum and hide in the baptismal font until you hear the sound of a horse galloping on the roof. Do not come out until the neighing sounds like a woman laughing. If the organ begins to play on its own, do not stop it. It is playing a requiem for someone currently in the room. If the music is upbeat, it means you are the guest of honor. Leave a bowl of milk by the pipes and stay in the light. Dark corners are for uninvited guests. The basement stairs are strictly off limits. If the door opens, do not look down. There is a man at the bottom holding a lantern. He will ask you for a match. We do not use fire in the basement. Tell him the sun is coming and he will go back to the boiler. If the stained glass figures change positions, do not panic. They are just stretching. However, if the Virgin Mary is missing from her window, she is behind you. Do not turn around. Continue mopping until you feel a cold breeze on your neck. This is her blessing. Only then may you continue. The collection plate must never be empty. Before you leave, place 1 item of personal value in the tray. This is the tithe of the soul. If the church deems it insufficient, the doors will not unlock at dawn, and you will become part of the morning mass. The night began with a heavy, oppressive stillness that felt like being trapped inside a tomb. Julian started with the pews in the rear of the church. He moved methodically, his mop leaving shimmering trails of lavender-scented water on the dark wood. He was halfway through Rule 1 when he felt a sudden, freezing draft that didn't come from any vent. On the third pew from the back, a dark, pulsing puddle of water was spreading. It didn't look like a spill. It looked like the wood was weeping. As he got closer, the smell hit him. Salt, brine, and the ancient rot of a shipwreck. He saw a single piece of green seaweed draped over the armrest. Julian's heart did a slow, heavy roll in his chest. He didn't clean it. He reached into the supply closet, grabbed a heavy purple prayer cloth, and draped it over the pew. He walked out the side door, counting his breaths in the cold night air. Exactly 10 minutes. When he returned, the cloth was bone dry and the air smelled of nothing but wax. By 1 a.m., the church felt like it was breathing. The stone walls seemed to expand and contract with the rhythm of Julian's own lungs. He was buffing the floors near the altar when Rule 5 triggered. The silence was shattered by a violent, discordant blast from the pipe organ. It wasn't a mournful hymn or a requiem. It was a frantic, joyous polka, a carnival sound that felt hideously, violently out of place in the Gothic gloom. Julian's skin pricked with a cold sweat. Guest of honor. That meant the things in the dark were celebrating him. He dropped his buffer and ran to the small kitchenette in the rectory, his hands shaking so hard he nearly dropped the carton. He poured a bowl of milk and placed it near the heavy lead pipes of the organ. As he set it down, he saw a pale, many-jointed finger reach out from the shadow of the pipes and pull the bowl into the darkness. The music slowed, turning into a low, satisfied hum, like a massive cat purring through a megaphone. He was recovering from the organ's blast when the candles at the front of the church suddenly flared to life. Rule 3. One by one, hundreds of white tapers ignited with a soft whoosh, bathing the sanctuary in a flickering, heatless orange glow. Julian looked at the floor immediately. He could see the shadows of people, hundreds of them filling the pews. He heard the rustle of heavy wool fabric, the soft, wet coughing of a congregation that hadn't breathed in decades, and the rhythmic chanting of a language that sounded like stones clicking together in a riverbed. He stayed in the vestibule, mopping the same 3-foot square of tile over and over. He focused on a single crack in the stone, his knuckles white on the mop handle. He could hear them rising for the gospel, the floorboards groaning under the weight of things that cast shadows but had no bodies. He didn't look up, even when he felt 100 invisible eyes boring into the back of his head. At 3 a.m., the whispering started. Rule 2. It came from the central confessional, a heavy box of carved oak. Julian approached it with the vacuum, his boots echoing on the marble. Behind the velvet curtain, a voice was murmuring secrets that made Julian's ears bleed. Vivid, horrific descriptions of sins that hadn't been invented yet. "The Father is sleeping," Julian whispered, his voice cracking. He tapped the wood 3 times. Tap, tap, tap. The whispering didn't stop. It accelerated, turning into a frantic, wet sobbing. "But the Father must know," the voice wailed. "The Father must know what we did to the birds." The sobbing shifted into a high-pitched, inhuman screaming that vibrated the very glass of the lanterns. Julian lunged for the industrial vacuum. The roar of the motor filled the nave. a blunt, mechanical wall of sound that drowned out the ghostly grief. He held the vacuum nozzle against the confessional door until the screaming faded into a low whimper, and then, finally, silence. When he pulled the curtain back to check, the interior was empty, but the wood was scored with deep, jagged claw marks. It was 4:30 a.m. when the exhaustion finally took its toll. Julian's mind was a frayed wire, sparking with every shadow. He entered the side chapel to polish the brass rails and saw St. Peter. The statue, a life-sized work of gray stone, was no longer facing the altar. His head had been turned 180 degrees, his blank stone eyes staring directly at the heavy oak entrance of the church. Julian's heart seized. He remembered Rule 4, lock the sanctum, hide in the baptismal font. But in his fatigue, he did the one thing he was told not to do. He looked at the statue's eyes. He stared, mesmerized, trying to see if the stone pupils were dilating. The air in the room didn't just turn cold, it curdled. The oxygen seemed to vanish, replaced by a thick metallic pressure. A heavy rhythmic thud, 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 began to echo from far above. It wasn't the wind. It was the sound of iron-shod hooves striking the shingles of the church roof with enough force to crack the oak beams. Julian realized with a jolt of pure terror that he hadn't locked the inner sanctum doors. He scrambled for them, his feet slipping on the polished floor, but as he reached the handles, they began to vibrate. Something was on the other side, something that breathed with a heavy, wet, rattling rasp. He couldn't lock it now. He was too late. He lunged for the baptismal font, a large marble basin filled with grayish, consecrated water. He climbed in, clothes and all, and submerged himself up to his nose. The water was cold enough to stop his heart, smelling of old pennies and rain. The inner doors didn't open. Instead, a voice, deep, vibrating, and ancient, spoke through the wood. "The janitor is awake," it rumbled, the sound vibrating the water around Julian's ears. He watched the saint. He watched the stone. He owes a debt of sight to the guest. The horse on the roof let out a piercing metallic neigh that sounded like a saw cutting through bone. Julian squeezed his eyes shut under the water, his lungs screaming for air. He stayed there, shivering violently for over an hour. The scratching at the door was constant, a slow, rhythmic peeling of wood, as if a giant bird were trying to carve its way in. But whatever was out there couldn't cross the threshold of the consecrated water. As the first sliver of gray, pre-dawn light touched the top of the stained glass windows, the weight on the roof vanished with a final, booming kick. The church seemed to sigh, the pressure in the room finally equalizing. Julian climbed out of the basin, his movements slow and robotic. He was soaked to the bone, his skin a pale, sickly blue. He looked up at the windows. Rule 7. The Virgin Mary was gone from her pane, leaving behind only a void of clear, cold glass. Julian felt a breath of ice-cold air on the back of his neck, a sensation like a frozen finger tracing his spine. He remembered the rule: do not turn around. He didn't. He walked to the front of the church, mopping the floor with his one dry hand while the other gripped his freezing chest. He felt a presence behind him, a towering, silent grace that watched his every move. He mopped until the cold breeze on his neck faded into the warmth of the rising sun. Finally, he reached the collection plate near the exit. Rule 8. The tithe. Julian reached into his pocket. His fingers brushed his wallet, his keys, and then settled on his grandfather's silver pocket watch. It was the only thing he had left of his family, a piece of history that had survived wars and poverty. He looked at the heavy oak doors, still bolted shut. He looked at the watch. With a trembling hand, he placed it in the brass tray. The watch didn't just sit there. It seemed to sink into the metal of the tray, vanishing as if the plate had swallowed it. A soft, inviting click echoed through the vestibule. The heavy doors were unlocked. Julian stepped out onto the stone porch. The morning air was crisp and sweet, a sharp contrast to the stagnant, holy rot of the interior. Father Miller was waiting there, sitting on a stone bench, watching the fog lift from the valley. He held a thick manila envelope in his lap. He handed it to Julian without looking at him. "You're late with the milk next time, Julian," the priest said, his voice flat. "The organ doesn't like to wait for its guest of honor. And you really shouldn't have looked at Peter. He's a sensitive soul." Julian opened the envelope. Inside were 12 $100 bills, more money than he usually made in a month. He looked at his hands. They were still stained with the grayish hue of the baptismal water, and his grandfather's watch was gone forever. He looked at the church. It looked perfectly normal in the morning light, a quaint, peaceful landmark of the town. But he knew what lived in the basement stairs, Rule 6. The man with the lantern he had successfully avoided by shouting about the sun. He knew about the drowned parishioner. Julian looked at the cash, then at his car, then back at the heavy oak doors. He was exhausted, terrified, and fundamentally changed. But $1,200 was the difference between a life and a slow disappearance. "I'll be here at 10, Julian whispered. Father Miller smiled, and for a fleeting second, his eyes sharpened, revealing a depth of age that was impossible for a human being. "Good. The saints were starting to like the way you mop. They said you have a very rhythmic soul." Julian got into his car, the heater blasting, but he couldn't get warm. He knew that tonight, the rules would happen in a different order, and he knew that eventually, he would run out of personal items to put in the plate.